we'll commercialize all these technologies in the US, and then the rest of the world will take them up because we'll make them cheaper. But one of the biggest challenges facing developing economies is actually just the cost of capital. Cost of capital in middle and low income countries can be 2 to 3 times that of wealthy countries like the US. And those kind of costs of capital will kill a lot of the economics of even cheap solar.
Hello, good morning and good afternoon. Welcome today to our expert spotlight with Kurt Waltzer, Senior Advisor at Clean Air Task Force. There's a school of thought around the energy transition that what is holding us back or what is constraining us is no longer technology. So we figured out all the technological developments that we need to transition properly. Within that school of thought, a lot of people think that it's going to be financing and infrastructure and system capacity that are now the new constraints. So today we'll be having Kurt Waltzer, who is a senior advisor at the Clean Air Task Force, tell us a little bit about why this is the case. Kurt, before becoming senior advisor, was the CEO and MD of the Clean Air Task Force and has over 3 decades of experience in advancing system-level strategies for decarbonization. His work spans emerging technologies, infrastructure policy, and financing frameworks, including the CATF's recent system Bankability initiative that we will be talking about today. Kurt, so when you look at the current deployment rates of emerging clean technologies, the gap between innovation and the scale and scaling that innovation is usually large. From your perspective, what are the fundamental reasons why clean energy and industrial projects struggle to attract risk-aligned capital?
Well, Tam, this is increasingly being referred to as the missing middle of finance. You've got venture capital that's literally investing in thousands of different kinds of climate solutions, and I'm ring fencing that just around what I would call the large energy infrastructure projects like advanced nuclear, advanced geothermal, carbon capture, blue-green hydrogen. And I think the challenge facing investment for those technologies really comes down to the fact that venture is great at initial startups, but it's not used to the scale necessary to really commercialize the technology in terms of investment. So, as an example, I mean, this is a a notable example. Google only had $25 million worth of investment before it had a commercial product that was out in the world. Companies like Fervo and Geothermal and Oklo and advanced nuclear are well into the hundreds of millions of dollars raised and getting to, in some cases, close to $1 billion raised just to get to their first of a kind project and to reach really what I would call commercial offering. That is well beyond a first of a kind project, or what is, and through the milestone of what is sometimes referred to as nth of a kind project, which another way to think about that is when you have a really good design spec that's replicable for your technology, and all the way to where really you can access low cost debt and equity for financing. And that's a long, difficult trail for these commercial technologies to go through, but the risk that the technologies are facing, the multiple risks, really don't match up with the capital supply that doesn't want a lot of risk. The large infrastructure, funds, think BlackRock, or the large banks like JP Morgan or Bank of America. They want very little risk when they're putting $500 million or $2 billion into financing a project. And so that missing middle is really a very challenging barrier for any technology to go through, the entities that are best positioned to do that are the very large corporates, the Exxons, the entities that have large balance sheets, but they're not really focused on that particular challenge. So it's the investors and the technology companies that are focused on it, enthusiastic about it, aren't in a position to really travel that commercialization path. And the entities that can finance that, or even as corporates, actually do the projects, aren't really interested in doing it. So it's a real challenge.
Okay, so just going back through history and thinking about this, we built the largest ships and the largest bridges, and even the electrical industry, the transformer and the power plants. We did all this like 150 years ago. So are you saying that around that time, the financial system was much more positioned to support these heavy industries, even when they were at a technological readiness level of, 1 or 2 or 3? What is the difference between then, when we could finance and build these large projects, and now?
So let's look at a couple of different examples of what worked and what didn't. Nuclear, when it started in the 1950s, commercial nuclear had the support of the Atomic Energy Commission, which was really a scaffolding around the nascent industry. It really supplied a lot of financial support and regulatory support to get the technology to the point where they could offer a first-of-a-kind project to the large utilities. And the large power companies or utilities at that time were the traditional integrated regulated utilities, where they often were able to pretty much be assured of rate recovery for any time they were building a new project. So you had the scaffolding provided by the government. You had a very clear line of sight into adequate revenue to cover the cost of the project. And interestingly, at the beginning of that period, the two primary companies that were offering or building these projects, Westinghouse and General Electric, allowed no variation on their technologies. So they went first of a kind all the way to their nth of a kind or design spec, without the power companies messing at all with what they were doing. The last important point on that is this was happening in the 1950s to the 70s in terms of its early development, back at a time when demand growth for power was like 7% per year. So what happened? What happened was a couple of things. As the rest of the world came back from the Second World War, and Japan and Germany, for example, became more competitive, that 7% demand growth for industrial development in the U.S. went down to about 3%. So demand growth dropped a lot. Utility companies kind of got lazy in the sense that they started working with the GEs and the Westinghouses and really developing more bespoke designs. So the designs became bigger, more complicated for whatever the utilities thought they needed for a particular site, and more expensive at a time when revenue was going down. So industrials and other customers began to really challenge that process, and the nuclear heyday kind of got cut short. We had a lot of projects built, but those conditions really created risks that were untenable, and as a result, nuclear didn't really take off beyond where it had, beyond a certain level, where it stayed for many decades. Gas, on the other hand, gas turbines were basically commercialized as jet engines primarily initially through the military, and then later commercial aviation use, and then they were repurposed in the 80s and 90s for power. It really wasn't that big of a leap to do that in terms of technology risks. So that already had sort of pre-existing kind of support to get to that point. And unlike nuclear, because they were basically manufactured on the shop floor at General Electric and other turbine suppliers, they had a very standardized product that they could it was well understood how to develop those projects once a few of them were developed. So they were able to access really low cost debt financing, non-recourse debt financing. And we saw a boom in gas turbine deployment in 2000, 2001 that eclipsed anything that had come before that. It was just incredibly successful. So in both cases, the conditions existed in part because of previous government support and in part because, at least in gas cases, just the risk profile of the deployment for those projects were very low. They were able to move forward quickly. So I think I think that's how, those are examples of how in history these technologies have been able to been deployed at scale. And now we're faced with a series of conditions where we're certainly going to need some level of government support for these technologies in various areas. But again, the market players are kind of new. The whole venture tech startup ecosystem that didn't exist back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And so we kind of have to really think about what is going to be necessary to take the world as we have it now and accelerate getting it through this commercialization process.
Okay, that's a good point. So let's go now to thinking about what needs to exist in the world to make these projects work. So your recent work has been around the idea of systemic bankability. So for those who haven't read the report, could you explain the concept and what it is specifically for the deployment speed and deployment and scale of deployment?
Sure. So the basic idea is in order for a technology to really take off commercially, it has to have access to low-cost debt and equity financing. When typically, we've seen this in gas, we've seen this in wind and solar. When that happens, projects get built, they usually get bought out, and the debt or the equity that was put into those projects might get recycled, might get paid off and recycled back to the next project. So you have this churn of capital that can really help drive technology deployment up the S curve. That's really the target. That's where we want to go with these technologies. After interviewing some technology startups as well as different players in the capital stack, the VCs, growth equity, infrastructure funds, and large banks, we came up with 9 areas of risk that we think need to be managed and mitigated in order for that kind of low-cost capital to flow. So another way to think about this term systemic bankability, it just means that if you're developing a project using one of these technologies, typically you're going to be able to access that kind of low-cost capital. In order to get that, we think that you really need to be addressing these 9 risk areas, which include some of which are very familiar, some of which less, but construction cost overruns, technology performance, access to adequate revenue for the period of financing, regulatory certainty, infrastructure, access to adequate infrastructure, managing social acceptance, access to adequate supply chains, access to commercial insurance, and access to what we term delivery capacity, which it includes the construction workforce, the operation workforce, the EPC firms, the construction firms that actually are, you have choices among firms that can build these things, and even within the finance world, enough knowledge about these kind of deals so that deal flow can move forward quickly. So those are the risk areas, and some of those risks are really high in the first of a kind project or the second of a kind project. Some are more of a concern as you go further down that commercialization path, but they all are something we would submit the technology startups and investors need to be thinking about even before they build a first of a kind project. And we really need to be thinking about what kind of initiatives or structures can provide the scaffolding that's necessary to move these technologies through that curve.
So I was looking at the risk factors, the 9 of them, the 9 categories, and they seem to cover the entire gamut of projects from, first of a kind to nth of a kind. But I specifically identified 3 of them that I'm very curious about, and I wanted to get your thoughts on. The first one would be the cost overrun, construction cost overrun risk. The second one would be regulatory uncertainty, and the third one would be commercial insurance unavailability. Now, for a first of a kind project, it's near impossible to be able to mitigate this cost risk as much as possible. You don't know how much, you've never built this project before, so your project could essentially go into construction cost overrun, which could basically destroy the viability of your project. You have no regulatory structure to follow because you're doing something for the first time and you're usually learning by doing. And almost no commercial insurance entity would insure your project because they don't know the different ways your project can fail and they wouldn't want to take that liability. So as a project developer, how do I navigate this properly?
So I would modify what you just said a little bit. It's not every project doesn't necessarily have to have cost overruns, but it's likely that you're going to have some cost overruns. So the goal is to minimize that. So you are in such a way that the investors understand how the risks are being minimized and see the potential impact of that. But I'll give you an example of a project that actually didn't have cost overruns. Petra Nova, which was it's probably the first example of large-scale carbon capture applied to a coal plant in the U.S. That actually came in on time and on budget, which is admittedly rare for first of a kind, but it was able to accomplish that. So it's not impossible for these large projects. However, part of the reason for that success is it was the large corporate that was doing it. It had experience in managing those the kinds of units that the CCS was applied to. It had some experience in developing at scale, so it was able to take that kind of experience and apply it. I think, broadly speaking, for managing cost overrun risks on the commercial side, it's unfortunately fairly bespoke experience that's necessary, in my view, to manage that. So there needs to be significant experience in actually developing first-of-a-kind projects applied to that effort. Someone who knows how to manage an EPC firm, someone who knows actually which EPC firm will be best to choose. A significant investment in engineering studies up front to really minimize the errors or where the potential errors will be in costs. I mean, in short, it would be important on the commercial side to really secure the kind of experience that has that knowledge set that could understand how to minimize both the technology cost risks in terms of overrun, as well as the labor part, the EPC firms. So that's the commercial side. But with all these risks, once you take a hard look at it, there may be spaces where the risk is just irreducible. And that's when you have to start thinking about policy. So there may be policy options in terms of, you mentioned commercial insurance. It's extremely difficult to get first of a kind commercial insurance. It's worth, I think, some further exploration as to whether or not the insurance industry is capable of pulling those kinds of instruments together in a way that's affordable. I think it's a tall order, but they are starting to look at that more seriously. But there may be also need for, on the policy side, examples of government stepping in to say, well, we'll offer the commercial insurance for the first project in the same way that, they have, for example, the loan program office at the Department of Energy. So I think you kind of have to, what I would say is, do the best and utmost diligence on the commercial side to minimize those risks, and then you really understand the degree to which policy has to come in and cover the rest.
Yeah. You did mention about the nuclear industry, and while you were talking, I was just thinking about the Price-Anderson Act that kind of helped mitigate the liability that could potentially come from, nuclear fallout. But in the report, you also use nuclear as an example of how projects can have system bankability, then lose system bankability. And I'm wondering why that is the case. So it seems to be the case that system bankability is something you always need to have as a heuristic when you think about the successful deployment of a project. Why was this the case for nuclear, though?
Well, go back to the little story I mentioned before on nuclear. It started to move out of the systemic bankability space, sweet spot, when the market changed, when the demand started to go down from the US. So instead of growing 7% per year, it was 3% per year. So these costs were spread over a smaller pool. The utility companies and the nuclear technology suppliers kind of got lazy and greedy. They decided, okay, we've done this, sort of the basic way. Now we're going to add costs because we think we can, because we our utility commissioners have always given us whatever rate recovery we've asked for. So we're going to, do some things that are really expensive and shove it under rates, and we think we'll get it returned. And that actually wasn't the case. There were some projects that were just pulled because the customers, particularly the industrial customers, started to say, wait a minute, we're not going to cover this. This is getting ridiculous. So in that case, the revenue adequacy risk became too large. That was the primary issue. But in addition, because of the changes that they were making to the unit, some of the cost overrun risk became significant. And, even with, I would say, even with Plant Vogtle and Southern Company, they never finished their front-end engineering design study before they actually began construction, which is, if you really want to manage risks, one of the first things you have to do is finish your front-end engineering design study. And as we know, those costs, increased substantially.
Yeah.
So I think that's an example of, to your point, that's a good example of when you are in that spot, you need to make sure that there's continued diligence on managing the risks and ensuring the risks are adequately covered in order to stay in that systemic bankability. Real quickly, I would just say solar is another example that I'm concerned about now. We're supply chain issues with solar in terms of tariffs are certainly an impact, but also social acceptance, both for cultural reasons and also people are, in terms of the pace of build out and just people's concern about space in their backyard. Solar was golden from say 2010 through 2020, early 2020s, and now it's facing some headwinds. So I think that all of these risks have to be observed and managed in order to maintain that systemic bankability space.
Okay. So I am drawing a correlation between probably the 50s and the 60s to now. And why am I doing that? Around after the Second World War, it seemed to be the case that demand started to increase and we started to, demand more energy. So we kind of figured out, okay, let's set up the Atomic Energy Commission, instead of building out this nuclear plants. And, we estimated that growth was going to be 7% year on year. And eventually all that fell off in the 70s and 80s. And, we had problems with the utilities, and that led to the deregulation movement that started. Similar situation is happening right now. Our data centers, driven largely by artificial intelligence, the need to electrify a lot of our transportation, resilient spending. Everyone is very in line, which is 10 times more expensive than beating overhead lines. And we're seeing demand go up. Forecast is saying it's 10 times year on year. Is there the potential of us experiencing that same problem we had at some point where, what was real was no longer real? And now we get to the point where what is real is no longer real, and ratepayers are stuck with these prices, because we're seeing examples from Pennsylvania, the approval of rate cases that are adding billions of dollars to the rate base, right? How is this? What if this doesn't work out? How do we mitigate that risk now with the idea of system bankability?
Yeah, I love that question. So I would say certainly there's a risk. And I think just as an analog, you don't even have to go all the way back to the 50s and 60s. You could just think about the big gas boom that happened in 2000, 2001. That was driven by deregulation. There was a thought that you could build a lot of gas turbines around the country. Because of the improvements of the turbines, you'll be able to undercut potential other sources, coal plants in particular, in terms of providing low-cost service, which is in large part what happened. But that boom busted starting around 2002, because at some point the market was kind of maxed out. As a result, GE and Siemens and others that had ramped up their production capacity to meet all this massive increase in demand ended up getting into serious financial challenge, because by the time that capacity online, the boom was over. Now, I mean, that was a more contained risk for those companies, but certainly I think that given the growth in demand, that may be happening over a 7 to 10 year period. Who knows? Maybe that demand won't follow through, and plans to develop generation to meet it may end up being redundant. I think there's an interest in the hyperscalers' willingness to pay a green premium. The Amazons, the Microsofts, the Metas, being willing to pay above market rates for low carbon power, and I think there are examples of that. But how long will that growth period last, and what happens when the growth of the data centers fall off? So I think there's a lot of risk of simply relying on those trends. And I think the way that systemic bankability works is, if you think about it, right now it's a framework, but if you apply it, you would be asking the questions of not just for plant serial number 1, but serial number 5 and 10, and whatever number you think you need to get to in order to really access that low-cost debt. What are the risks of the changing conditions, and how are you going to mitigate that? How are you going to mitigate the revenue adequacy component of that, not just for the first project, but for the 10th or the 15th project? How are you going to address the infrastructure challenges? So this isn't directly related to AI, but as you start to develop some of these technologies, whether it's HALEU fuel for supply for advanced nuclear reactors, or being able to for geothermal, being able to find the best sweet spots for geologic heat reservoirs and transmission lines. The further you grow, the larger the number of projects you create, you're going to have to be thinking about the risks of diminishing returns on some of those, and are the systems, are the supply systems and the infrastructure systems able to support that? So I think that the way you apply this is you have to do some think about the risks and do some scenario planning as projects go through that commercialization path. There's one criticism I have today about this conversation. It is so focused on first of a kind. It's focused on, can we use data centers to help develop the first of a kind project for nuclear, first of a kind project for geothermal, advanced geothermal, which is a important strategic idea. but it isn't going to get you through the commercialization path. What the systemic bankability framework is trying to convey is this kind of risk mitigation thinking needs to be applied upfront, not for first of a kind, but all the way through the process. And that's what we're not seeing, I think, in a lot of the commercialization efforts for these technologies.
Okay, so how should regulators then think about allocating and mitigating this risk, especially across the 7 or the 9 risk factors?
Well, so you're not going to like my answer, but I'm going to give it because I think it's the real answer. I think it's all context dependent on the technology and the market. So I think it's important to, we've been talking about the U.S., which is, but we haven't said that. But really, we're just talking about the U.S.
Yeah.
But if you're thinking about technology commercialization that's global in nature, you really need to be looking at all the relevant political jurisdictions and associated markets. So Europe's going to be different than the U.S. Similarities will be different. Japan, South Korea, all the wealthy countries will have some different aspects about their markets and political jurisdictions. And then you're thinking about the middle income countries and the low income countries. So the details of that really matter. That's one answer to the regulatory question, is it depends on who the regulators are. But it's also dependent on the technology and the relevant regulations. So are you in a regulated utility market or a deregulated utility market? Who is the relevant regulator for the technology? If you're nuclear, you're certainly concerned about the NRC. If you're in the geothermal world, you're concerned about the EPA and the underground injection control regulations. So you have to sort of think about who the regulator is. I think, but maybe implied in what you were saying was this question of utility regulator, because that's an important component of regulation relative to the AI question scenario you were talking about. And in that case, I think that utility regulators are, I think, risk averse by nature. And they're also concerned, they're concerned about affordability, they're concerned about reliability, they want to keep their systems working. So I think the regulators really need to become part of the conversation of risk management. Not just thinking about the risk of the technology itself, but thinking about the risk and benefits to the systems for bringing some of these technologies online. So I would say from a utility regulatory perspective, this circle of thinking about risk kind of needs to be expanded to include them in thinking about what their needs are, since their approval is going to be really critical for, in some environments, for these technologies moving forward.
That's a good point. But I wanted to just push back on that a little bit, because in the report, you do mention that, especially when we think about first of a kind projects, from a policy standpoint, the governments would provide, grant funding for these projects or guarantees.
Yep.
And after the projects have successfully, or the technology is successfully scaled, governments would provide tax credits and things of that nature to kind of keep it going. Yep. But it seems to be the case that the report says that is not enough. We need to do more. So to doing more, is it around some other aspects of the risk profile of the technology as they scale across time that we should be watching for? So, for example, you did mention something around solar, opposition to solar projects, which has been the case. We've seen a lot of communities fight back on solar. Is that what we should be looking at? And sometimes, or supply chain limitations of these projects over time?
Yeah. I think the first, tax credits, grants, loan guarantees, those are all basically addressing. They're either directly addressing unit economics, or they're kind of blunt instruments to absorb the risk that investors. So if you're, I'm just making this up, but if you have a project where the cost of capital is, 300 basis points higher than what it would be if it were a commercialized technology, you can have a government form of financing that absorbs that risk and covers it, so other capital from the market can come in and manage that. So that's and it doesn't matter what the risk is. It's just, you're covering the risk cost. So that's kind of a blunt instrument. But there are other ways to think about managing risks. So for example, let's take geothermal, because I think this is kind of a new and interesting space. Geothermal used to be, cordoned to small, volcanically active places where the heat was close to the surface. And now, because of advancements in engineering of geothermal and being able to drill deeper into, the focus on drilling deeper, the use of it expands. But what that means is there needs to be a better sense of where those heat reservoirs are that can be accessed, and what kind of risk is there. Every time you go to a new heat reservoir, you could think of it as a first of a kind reservoir risk. So one way that policy could address or minimize that risk is, and this is some of my colleagues at CTF have been thinking about this, is you could have the USGS start to do surveys and really do better heat mapping, and maybe even some initial injection wells to understand how the heat flows through the reservoirs. So, the degree to which the government's willing to pay for that, some of that's not that expensive, some of it's a little more expensive, but those kinds of things could accelerate, de-risk some of those questions and accelerate the deployment. Because again, every slice of risk that you're able to manage, you're able to have better terms in your financing. So that's an example of thinking about these policy interventions, not just how much more money can you put on the table, but how do you actually surgically address the risks in these different areas that will help accelerate and make projects more viable.
Okay. So it seems to be the case that largely from, the conversation today and the report that, the systemic bankability, implicitly takes into national security as an important role, especially when you look at supply chain limitations. So We've been talking about the US for now. So let's go globally. What are the macroeconomic and geopolitical dynamics that are kind of affecting the speed of energy development with respect to how we think about systemic bankability? Because for some of the technologies that we have and are trying to scale, and in some markets in the US, scaling with blinding speed, for example, in ERCOT, with the deployment of lithium phosphate-based batteries. But we're seeing that the supply chains of a lot of those units are not in the US or in other countries, and some countries not very friendly to the US. How do you think about addressing some of these problems?
Yeah, so it's a really great question. I think that, well, let me step back a minute and just, the US-China geopolitical questions aside, let's just think about China. One of the ways that China's been able to scale these technologies so well and so quickly is they kind of have control over all the levers relative to these risks, whether it is because a lot of those companies are state-owned, they're able to, and both on the consumption and supply side, they're able to and effectively manage those kinds of risks. They're able to manage social acceptance risk, infrastructure risk. So they're within China itself, there's the government has a lot of levers they can pull. Where it gets more complicated for China is when it goes outside of China, which is mostly what they're focused on, because they're focused on exports. So solar panels, for example, obviously with tariffs, have had a significant impact on solar panel exports to the US. Therefore, they're looking for other markets. And I think it remains to be seen how successful that's going to be. Interestingly, China itself has scaled back on just recently on its own incentives that it's supplying for solar panel manufacturers. I think in a bid to sort of winnow out excess supply and get them more, have more market discipline. But in any event, that we're seeing in real time whether or not that kind of success can be maintained if you don't have something like a U.S. market that, for policy-driven reasons, was a ready customer. Nuclear is going to be another interesting example in China. China for years tried to take a run at really becoming a major player in engineering, procurement, construction firms outside of China, because you can build things really rapidly in China. They have scale issues. They thought they could apply. It didn't quite go the same way as it did with manufacturing products. And so whether or not they're going to be able to take their skill set in developing a lot of nuclear in China and shift that globally, I think that also kind of remains to be seen. So I think that's sort of one interesting thing to think about. They're going to have to think about managing risks without in these other markets, without the kind of benefits or levers that they have internally within that country. So that's sort of one interesting question. The other one, though, that I think is really important and is not getting enough attention is the thought is we'll commercialize all these technologies in the US and then the rest of the world will take them up because we'll make them cheaper. But one of the biggest challenges facing developing economies is actually just the cost of capital. The cost of capital in middle and low income countries can be 2 to 3 times that of wealthy countries like the US and in Europe. And those kind of costs of capital will kill a lot of the economics of even cheap solar panels. So I think that that's a little, those are kind of the risks that we didn't address in the systemic bankability framework, but you can conceptually kind of expand it and say, okay, here are the risks of the technology. But if you're looking at Nigeria or sub-Saharan Africa, for example, you need to be thinking about what are the risks that drive cost of capital or even foreign exchange risk in those countries, and how are those risks going to be a barrier to deployment? And I think that I think this framework is useful for thinking about the technology commercialization space within wealthy countries, but it can also be used to really frame some of these questions more broadly. And what conditions have to be true in order for commercialization to be happening, not just in the wealthy countries, but globally.
You make a good point talking about some of the macroeconomic risk with respect to how we finance this project in developing countries. So if you want to build, as a project developer, you want to build a large plant, for example, in the Congo. I was doing some research on electrifying a couple of cities inland in Africa, and I realized that in many of those cities, which are large cities by any scale or proportions, many of them 1 to 5 million people, they have no single road, like no single paved road connecting any of the cities to the coast. And in some cases, you have to go through multiple countries to get to the closest city. So you can't even come in through the other side. So for example, if you wanted to go to the city of Kisangani in the DRC, you can't go through Matadi, which has a coast. You have to go through Mombasa and drive all through Uganda into the DRC. Yep. Does this system bankability framework kind of think through about addressing some of those projects? Because it seems to be the case that enabling infrastructure, for example, is risk number 5. That just basically kills any project. Would it tell you that, okay, at some point you get to this threshold after going through the 9 risk factors that, okay, it's not possible to do this project? So should we So these are two-pronged questions. Should that be a way of thinking about this project? And secondly, if, for example, you get a bad assessment, should we just give up on these projects? Are there ways by which you can think about mitigating some of this risk in an interesting way to make these projects happen?
So I think that that is the first place you start, which is you think about it on a project basis, and then you do that kind of analysis, and you may conclude based on if you looking out the window today, this project is feasible. But I also think you don't stop there. Then you start to think, okay, what conditions have to be true in order to be feasible, and what are the levers that can be pulled to make those conditions feasible? In terms now, where I think it gets even more complex in a place like the DRC, or really any low or low middle income developing country in particular, is that question of infrastructure is really tied up to a lot of complicating factors, but one of them that I just don't think gets enough attention is the development of domestic financial markets within those countries. I think that there's the typical response on project finance within, say, sub-Saharan Africa or other low middle income countries is, well, we'll just use concessional finance from the World Bank, or something like that. And the World Bank doesn't have a lot of concessional finance. They're just, the scale of that is very small. There may be some thoughts that the government will provide a backstop, but the governments are already stretched because of their government loans. There's just not a lot of space there. Ultimately, capital is going to have to come from the development of financial markets within those countries themselves. And there's a lot of interest, I think. Certainly, I know there is in sub-Saharan Africa of how to better manage things like foreign exchange risk using local hard assets in sort of creative ways. How to create more liquidity in the banking system, and what are ways to make it more palatable for pension funds to keep their assets in country instead of sending them over to the London or New York. And I think that this sounds very far from project development, but for these regions, I think it's actually critical in terms of thinking about scalability to start to include that in this thinking.
So does that, because if you have to do something like that, it seems to be the case that you have to go in country by country, right? And address this problem. So there is difficulty in scaling a solution because every country is probably different. And if you can't scale the solution, if every time you think about some creative way to use some assets somewhere to create some kind of security that allows you finance a project somewhere, it looks to me that you have to choose and trade off between what you can do to get the best value from what you have to leave on to the next time, and hoping that the next time when that comes around, you still have the same similar conditions for you to reapply the same analysis you did before, so you don't have to do something new. So it seems to me that there's a difficulty in just in scaling any real solution across board. Or is it, we should think about it instead of categorical change, we should just think about it in small incremental changes?
Well, I think where you sit depends on where you stand, right? So if you're a technology company, you're worried about commercialization, the market's going to focus on first the US and Europe, and that makes sense. And so I think that it's a viable way to think about that, as we can drive technologies beyond nth of a kind to really drive them down the learning curve, get them to the point where we really kick the tires and understand their value, just in some of these upper income markets. But if you're thinking about, say, decarbonization, then I think these wealthy countries are great for that commercialization, but if you look at the projections, most of the energy production and most of the energy consumption is going to come from the developing world in the future, not the OECD. It's already there, and it's only going to get bigger. So I think your question is relevant to that. And unfortunately, I think you do have to go country by country and market by market. The good news is, I think that there's a virtuous circle that can happen as countries get better at managing, developing domestic financial markets, as they get smarter about infrastructure challenges. Then I think there will be a positive knock-on effect with, in terms of countries learning from each other and countries coordinating with each other. Some of my colleagues at CATF are working on, initiatives to improve the the functionality really of the East African and West African power pools. This is typically not something that comes up in climate discussions. It's really, first and foremost important in terms of economic development, but it's also critical for thinking about how these technologies deploy globally. You sort of have to do the hard work on all the aspects that relate to these kinds of risks, if you're truly thinking about global deployment. And that's if there's no other takeaway from the thinking about systemic bankability, it is you have to think about it in terms of markets and political jurisdictions. You just can't think about it in terms of, well, if the US does this, everything's fine. Or if US and Europe does this, everything's fine. Or China does something special, then great, everything's taken care of. Just isn't that easy.
From the audience, if there are any, and please feel free to go off mute to ask your question or type it in the chat while I just read it out.
So I have a question. I don't know if you can hear me.
Of course, go ahead, Prophet.
Yeah, so I think one of the challenges that I think, most of the, let's say, entrepreneurs in Africa, they have been facing is like the cost of capital is very, very high, And I would like to hear how, at least, what can be done so that at least, this issue of high cost of capital can be solved, because this is actually one of the hindrance that we face when we are fundraising. So,
yeah, that I think is the central question, and I think in the very short run, there is some amount of concessional capital from multilateral development banks and other sources that can be used to address that, but that's in high demand, so across many different economic areas. But still, I think that's kind of a near-term answer, but ultimately I think that there are things that, before I leave that point, even without going into the concessional side, I think that there are things that some of those multilateral development banks can do and are starting to do to help develop the financial markets locally, like having more of their deposits and loans occur within the domestic currency instead of having them in euros or dollars. And that really does two things. It helps the domestic banking liquidity, which helps those markets and has some positive effect on the cost of capital, and it avoids the significant penalty you get from having to pay back, the foreign exchange risk that comes back from having to pay back in dollars and euros. So I think those are kind of short-term things that help. I think in the long term, though, ultimately the initiatives are going to have to come within the countries themselves in furthering developed domestic capital markets, which I think some of the donor or upper income countries can supply things like technical support, but ultimately I think I think should, but ultimately in the larger term, I think a lot of this is going to have to come from the financial markets really developing the systems that will grow capital in the region, keep capital in the region, And again, it has that virtuous circle effect. That's not an easy thing to do, but I think ultimately for scale, that's kind of what has to happen.
It's a good point. Thanks, Kurt. I really want to thank you and appreciate you for taking the time to be here today. This was great. They learned a lot, system bankability, how we think about projects going forward. We should look at the 9 risk factors that affect these projects and always keep a tab on them, because projects could achieve system bankability at some point, or technologies could achieve system bankability at some point, and at some point fall out of it. So it's incumbent on us to continue ensuring that our technological development maintains that, so we can scale them much faster to address the problems that we face. And thank you all for attending this expert spotlight. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day to be here and engage in this great conversation. Thank you, everybody, and until next time, be safe and be well.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.